No discussion of documents today. We'll just get right to it. Chapter 20 looks at the 1920s, 1920 to 1932. It bleeds into the early 30s because President Roosevelt, who was elected in November of 1932, but then took office in, was it March? March 1933. He initiated a whole new era in American politics called the New Deal, for which you'll be writing your first paper for me. So that's why the 1920s to 32 can be looked at as one big event. Why? Because there was the themes of this 12-year period, that it was a period, at least at the beginning, before the Great Depression, it was a period of tremendous economic expansion. All right? But there was also people that benefited more than others, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Another theme of the 1920s in America was the incredibly strong relationship between business and government, which made it bad for things like labor unions, who, just like the late 19th century, the government and businesses were the enemies of unions again. So it was hard to be a member of a labor union. This period also saw the birth of the modern fight for civil liberties. When this country was founded and you had the 10 Amendments, right to free speech, assembly, etc., it was a law, it was written down, but it was often contravened or ignored. In, when was it? I think it was 1798. So essentially 7 years after the Bill of Rights were created, the American government passed the Alien and Sedition Act, which criminalized any speech which attacked the government. It was fundamentally against the First Amendment, but the government passed the law anyway because it was a time of international crisis. And this interference with freedom of speech happened repeatedly through the 19th century. In the early 20th century, we talked about how women's rights activists and labor groups who were threatened with being shut down, they would sue on their First Amendment rights, and slowly but surely the courts started to recognize you have to allow people to say what they want to say, even if you don't like it, as long as they're not, yelling fire in a crowded theater and causing death and destruction. Freedom of speech means you get to say whatever you want, even if it's unpopular. And increasingly in this period, this notion that civil liberties must be defended at the highest levels to protect individuals from government repression, the way we look at civil liberties today, it begins now, where people started taking their issue against government and business right to the courts, and you now start getting this culture that the First Amendment principle should not be broken under virtually any circumstances unless it's a very finely detailed limit to First Amendment restrictions. And that's as far as I'm going to get today. Part 2 on, what day is today? Thursday? Part 2 on Tuesday will be these bottom 2 sections. So, let's start off with the decade of prosperity. What does that mean? There was a tremendous amount of economic expansion at this period. But again, it was for the few. Industry was expanding. Remember World War I? The Europeans destroyed themselves. They bankrupted themselves. America got involved in World War I, but the fighting took place 3,000 miles away, not on American soil. Yes, we lost soldiers, but nowhere near as much as the Europeans did. Moreover, our farms were not bombed, our industries were not bombed. We became the supplier for the Allies during World War I. We did economically quite well from World War I. And after World War I, when the Europeans were slowly rebuilding their economies, America was the economic supergiant of the world. So, industrially, America benefited from World War I in the war and afterwards, the 1920s. This gave vent to a belief that American business values were the way to organize American society. And what are business values? Competitive individualism. What does that mean? It means government shouldn't restrict economic competition. Whoever has a good idea should put it out there in the market, and the winners and the losers are going to be determined not by the government, not by regulation, but by the people. They buy what they want to buy, and that company stays in business. If they don't, they go out of business. The free market, again, the government doesn't restrict anything. It doesn't establish minimum wages, maximum work hours. It doesn't regulate anything, because the whole point is to allow businesses to operate in the free market, compete, and produce the best product possible. The problem with all this emphasis that competition is the best way to enrich everybody is that the emphasis is always on the individual. Allow the individual as much freedom to compete, innovate, and make as much money as possible, and in theory, all of society benefits. But the reality is, when you allow capitalism to develop in an unrestricted fashion, generally money is going to be made, yes, by everybody, but most of the money is going to be made by the elite few that own the factories, the banks, the mines, the big farms, not the workers, whose wages are kept low in order for the business owners to remain competitive on a global scale. Now, this economic expansion that I'm talking about is, like I mentioned, part of the expansion of new industries in the 1920s. What kind of new industries are we talking about? First of all, chemicals. The chemical industries exploded in the 1920s. Also, aviation. The first airplane created by the Wright brothers before World War I has now been perfected. Slowly but surely, safe commercial air travel, where people fly from city to city and across the Atlantic, becomes more and more common. So the aviation industries expand, and of course so do the jobs. Electronics. The first electronics, the cheap, readily available electronics, are now available in the 1920s. I'm talking about radios, record players. For the first time, these things are coming out of factories at cheap prices for the majority of people to afford. The biggest move forward for the American economy is the car. I talked a couple of classes ago that the first car, the first mass-produced, on an assembly line, affordable car by Henry Ford came out like one class ago. By this period, the 1920s, the assembly line production of inexpensive vehicles has been perfected. And Ford and other motor companies are just churning out hundreds and thousands of affordable cars. And with everybody buying these cars, the American industry expands. By 1929, this is a stunning number. In 1929, 85% of every vehicle in the entire world was made in the United States. Think about that in terms of how much of the market the U.S. cornered. 85% of all cars made in the world, made in the United States. Think of how many jobs that created. What did it lead to? A consumer society. I mentioned this briefly a couple of classes ago, but it wasn't just planes and chemicals and cars that expanded, but basic consumer products expanded. Meaning, the telephone. Virtually everybody owned a telephone now because it was so inexpensive. The washing machine. Everybody had one. It was inexpensive. The refrigerator, the vacuum cleaner. The result of all this, and I mentioned this briefly a few classes ago, was that as these products became more and more common, more and more affordable, and more people had them, regardless of their wealth, unless they were desperately, backbreakingly poor, it became a matter of your status. That if you didn't own these things, then you were obviously amongst the poorest of society, and nobody wanted to project that image. So people went into debt. to get this stuff in order to maintain their family's image. This was the era where buying on credit really exploded. The layaway plan, not credit cards just yet, but buying on credit. And that's how the industry kept pushing and pushing. People wanted to buy, but they didn't have cash on hand. So they put a down payment, and they paid the rest of it off on a layaway plan in installments. You also had the development for the first time in this country of celebrity culture. Everybody's got a record player now or a radio. Movies are cheaper and cheaper. So now people have a much more direct connection with celebrities. Celebrities emerge more and more as heroes. People that you look up to, that you emulate, that have significant influence in society. Now at the time, the celebrities were movie stars, radio personalities, etc. Today, obviously, sports figures, business figures, anybody who has a significant public persona is a celebrity, and that carries a lot of influence. This is also the period that Hollywood emerges as the world's leader in making movies and establishing this celebrity culture. Why is it important to isolate what this is, a celebrity culture? There's a reason why famous actors or musicians or sporting figures are asked by corporations to sell their running shoes or perfume or iPhone. We as a society associate figures that we on some level like with whatever product they happen to be selling in the commercial, magazine ad, etc. It is ultimately a means of social manipulation. There was a story that I heard on the radio a couple of days ago. It was on a podcast. And it said, you can Google this, how many celebrities have their own perfume or cologne? And off the top of your head, you might come up with a couple, but it's something like 3 dozen. 3 dozen celebrities have got their own perfume. Not just J-Lo, even people you think, why would they want a perfume? Right? But there's money in associating a star with a product. Think of how many running shoes, sporting apparel has been advertised by an athlete, right? Yeah. So this shapes our consumer culture. Because not only do you want to have the latest phone, you want the latest phone advertised by whatever. Like, look at this. The bumper on my iPhone, it purposely leaves the apple on the back of my iPhone visible. Why? Because you want to show the apple to show that you have an Apple phone. Because an Apple phone has got status, right? Steven's laptop, the bright apple on the top of the laptop, it's lit up. Apple were the first people to do this. Before, you would have like a little symbol that was sort of on the corner, like the original Mac laptops. But Apple perfected. That Apple symbol means you're on the cutting edge, you have the best technology, blah, 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 blah. It's only now that Microsoft is coming back with the Surface. Have you all seen this on commercials? Where it's a combination of iPad and laptop. And they finally got it. You have to have a cool product with cool commercials, otherwise no one's going to buy it. And the same thing with those phones, smartphones. It used to be all iPhones all the time. Now it's a competitive market. Now there's actually interesting smartphones across the spectrum. But who advertises them on TV? Or how are they advertised? Even if you don't have an individual, if they portray the image, if you own this, you'll be better than people who don't have it. That's the message you're getting. We're still living it today. But all of this doesn't mean that everybody was benefiting in the exact same way. Of course not. There were specific limits to all of this prosperity. For instance, there was an unequal distribution of wealth. What does that actually mean? If you looked at all the money made by everybody in America in the 1920s, most of it would have been owned by the top 5% of Americans. So, if there's million Americans in America, the top 5% would own most of the money. The bottom 95% had whatever's left over. It wasn't very equal. Industry kept growing and concentrating into fewer and fewer hands. There was less and less competition because industry was allowed to gobble up its weaker competitors. And they kept the prices purposely high once they ate up their competitors. The poverty and the unemployment in the midst of all of this prosperity was pretty high. For instance, most families didn't have any savings. All of these consumer goods I mentioned, they didn't buy them with cash. They bought them on credit because of this unequal distribution of income. Why was the economic distribution so unequal? Because there was no government regulation of capitalism. There was no real minimum wage. There was no social welfare network if you were out of work or sick. And in the North, where a lot of the industry had started, it was leaving the North because the cheaper jobs were in the South. So you had all those people unemployed in the North. But I think the biggest people that got hit in the 1920s were the farmers. In the early 20th century, farming started to expand after the Depression of the 1890s. Then you had World War I, where the American government helped farmers with government orders or subsidies or regulations. After World War I, the government stopped funding, subsidizing farmers. They said, we don't need this many farmers. You all will compete in the open market like everybody else. But at the time that the government stopped helping farmers with government orders and subsidies and protections, it was the exact same time that farmers around the world started rebounding from the trauma of the war. And if you have a lot of people producing the same thing, like grain, if you can buy your grain in Western United States, Western Canada, Argentina, Brazil, Russia, Germany, India, China, what happens when you have too much of a product? What happens to the prices? It drops, which means the original farmer loses money. They go into a tailspin of depression. And remember, this is an era of increasing easy transportation. You can sell any product around the world far less expensively now in the 1920s than ever before. So you, the consumer, you don't have to buy your corn from Nebraska. You could easily buy it from Russia and cheaper, because transportation is more modern and cheaper. And you, the consumer, are not going to pay more money for your food just because you want to help out a Nebraska farmer. No, you want to make sure you get the best price for your product. I mean, you get the best price for the things that you're buying. So, in spite of all of this unequal distribution of income, the fact that only some people were doing really well, the elites, the middle classes, the sort of workers that had pretty skilled jobs, because the American economy was in fact expanding, industry was in fact expanding, you had these consumer products just flying off the shelf, there was an increasing belief that America does best when American businesses do best, when American businesses are allowed to just do what they want to do, innovate, create, compete, and develop new products. That was the belief. It was the American business that was looked to produce the American way of life. And what was the American way of life? Having all of these consumer products that made your life more comfortable. American business did that for you. That was the belief in the 1920s. And the idea was American business was allowing for industrial expansion. It was allowing wages to go up because of the industrial expansion. It was producing a better quality of life. And this image that American businesses were the salvation of America, it wasn't just, economic numbers. Hollywood was producing films saying the businessman is the modern hero. Everybody wants to be like the modern businessman. You work hard, you get wealthy, you can control your destiny. And corporations, they had their own PR departments, also propagating this myth that the American businessman is the salvation of America, is the model, is the hero of America. Okay. What's the problem? The problem is, if American businesses are the heroes, American businesses are producing the American way of life, who's the enemy? Well, the enemy is the unions that want to put controls on the businesses, that want to force the American businessman to respect contracts, working regulations, minimum wages, fair wages, work hours. Because remember, the belief now is that free market capitalism produces the most wealth for the most people. Anybody that interferes, unions or governments, are interfering with your right to have a sewing machine, a telephone, etc., etc., etc. So unions are demonized. Remember last class I talked about the raids in 1919, 1920, where the federal government busted up unions and all socialist, anarchist, syndicalist groups. They were simply, the offices were broken into, records confiscated, leaders arrested, and if you weren't an American citizen, you were deported. And many of those socialists and radicals were in fact not American citizens. They were just deported. Thereafter, as businesses started really attacking unions, refusing to recognize them, refusing to organize with them, refusing to negotiate with them, union membership pretty much disappeared. 2 million people left their unions in the 1920s because they were thinking, what's the point? My union has no power. Why would I be a member and keep paying my dues? The businesses are refusing to recognize them. Government is not helping out at all. We're getting screwed. During this conservative era, it wasn't just organized labor that suffered from the conservative tendencies of the business community and their government allies. Even feminism started to crumble in this period. And it didn't really have anything to do with the economy. Feminism, after the women got the vote in 1920, was a victim of its own success. Let me explain. Up until women got the right to vote, all these women were unified by one thing. No matter where they lived, they were unified by one thing. If we get the right to vote, that'll solve most of our problems. But then after the vote was acquired legally, there wasn't a whole lot left that women agreed on in order to organize a political movement. For instance, black women in the South that still didn't have the vote because of the Jim Crow laws, that they were state laws that took the right to vote away from blacks. Black women still didn't have the right to vote in the South. So they wanted all women to organize to make sure that white women and black women had the right to vote. But white women had no desire to organize on behalf of black women. Secondly, there was this issue of what else are we willing to fight for? Feminism broke down into two wings. There was one group that said, we need to lobby the government to recognize that women have specific needs that are different from men. As mothers, for instance, government has to regulate whatever, salaries for working mothers, daycare, etc., to protect mothers, to ban child labor. Another group of feminists argued, no, the more you talk about women having specific needs, you take away from our main argument, which is 100% equal to men. Just everything should be equal down the line. And that division pretty much crushed the women's rights movement after they got the vote. And it didn't resurface until the 1960s, when you had this explosion of young women going to college that demanded equality plus. That's the second wave of feminism. So what did they agree on? What did women's freedom mean in the 1920s in the midst of the conservative reaction of governments and businesses, but also the breakup of the political coalition that got the vote? The one thing that many women could agree on, and that had the money to engage in this behavior was a sort of, I don't know what to call it, personal freedom. A reaction against the conservative morals of society. Women were now going out on their own much more frequently on their own, not being chaperoned by men. There was the desire to engage in the consumer economy on their own, have their own jobs, engage in the consumer society on their own. There was a greater demand for sexual freedom. The idea that you had to get married as soon as you hit 18 was increasingly not considered the mainstream. There was this belief that you were allowed to have this time between sort of like 18 and 25 where you go to work, you have some fun, eventually you get married, because that's what all, quote unquote, proper women are supposed to do, but you don't have to do it right away. There was this belief that take advantage of consumer society, expanding industry, more jobs. Now obviously, and this is a picture of what the flapper looks like. It doesn't look like a big deal, but a skirt that was at the knees versus all the way down to the ankles was revolutionary at the time. And the hair cut short, that was revolutionary at the time. So, what else is there? Okay. Now, a couple of the things I want to bring to you is this notion of the business and government relationship. In the 1920s, the Republicans basically took over the government. Woodrow Wilson, as the Democratic President of the United States during World War I, with all of his very progressive policies of government intervention in the economy, in helping unions, helping farmers, and also government, bringing America into World War I. After Wilson stepped down, Americans were tired of this expanding role of the federal government. They were just tired. And who did they vote for? They voted for the not Democrats, the Republicans. And not progressive Republicans like Theodore Roosevelt that believed that an expanding role of the central government is healthy and good, but very conservative Republicans that argued America does best when the government is small. It doesn't interfere in the economy. It doesn't raise taxes. It just stays as much in the background as possible. And these Republicans took over the presidency. They took over Congress. And so this is the government that the labor unions faced in the 1920s. A very hostile government to anybody that interfered with business. So this pro-business government, what did they do? The Republicans passed laws that kept taxes very low, income taxes, property taxes. They also imposed a high tariff so that foreign products could not come into America cheaply, which meant the American consumer had to buy only American-made goods, which may be more expensive than foreign-made goods. Good for the business owners, but crappy for the consumers. They supported employer anti-unionism, and all the business regulatory agencies that were created under the progressive governments, both Republican and Democrat, they weren't abolished. But the people appointed to those regulatory agencies, like the FDA, that regulated how food is produced, the people appointed to those agencies were now supporters of business, and they regulated as little as possible. Finally, the Supreme Court. Forgot about the Supreme Court. Another reflection of the incredibly conservative time of the 1920s were the people appointed to the Supreme Court and the decisions issued by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court in the 1920s passed, first of all the laws passed that limited child labor by previous governments or that guaranteed minimum wage for groups of workers, the Supreme Court outlawed them and said this is unconstitutional. It interferes with the basic ideal that business should not be regulated by government. Now here's the thing. The Supreme Court sells itself as simply the interpreters of the law with no prejudice and no bias. But that is obviously crap. because the Supreme Court said in the 1850s that blacks were not citizens in the Dred Scott case. The Supreme Court in 1896 upheld in Plessy versus Ferguson that you could separate public facilities according to race as long as you kept them equal. That way you could have legal segregation in spite of the fact that our Constitution guarantees equality to all people born in this country. But then the Supreme Court changed its mind in the 50s and the 60s. It passed laws that desegregated schools, for instance, or that upheld a woman's right to an abortion, or simply a woman's right to make whatever choice she wants. It cannot be legally enforced by government. So the Supreme Court changes with the times. In the 1920s, the times were conservative. The Supreme Court reflected that image in that thinking. In the face of a conservative Supreme Court, a conservative government, conservative business practices, people who demanded a protection of individual rights went a different direction. And thus was born civil liberties. Under the progressive governments, the belief was the only defender of the individual is a strong central government. The populists and the progressives argued this. They said, you want to protect the farmers, the government's got to regulate the railroads, because the railroads are the ones that are screwing the farmers. And laws were passed regulating the railroads. There was also a belief that if you want to protect the common man, you've got to protect the unions. Laws were passed guaranteeing union right to organize, and so on and so on. And remember, government also regulated food production. They stopped the creation of large corporate monopolies, in the belief that government needs to protect the little guy. Fine. But now the government is in the control of a conservative president, a conservative Congress, and a conservative Supreme Court. And the people who want to protect the little guy no longer have faith in the government. Because the government used to expand and take care of people, and now it's rapidly contracting and letting people fend for themselves. So these reformers, these people that want to help, these people who want to fight against continuing anti-socialism and book and film censorship, which is a holdover from World War I, they start looking in a different direction. They create the Civil Liberties Bureau, which identifies threats to civil liberties, First Amendment rights, specifically freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. They organize on that principle, and they fund legal cases and push them all the way to the Supreme Court, and there essentially force the Supreme Court to make a decision recognizing the violation of certain basic principles. Now, the Civil Liberties Bureau is the precursor, the granddaddy, of the American Civil Liberties Union of today, the ACLU. The ACLU today, like the Civil Liberties Bureau back then, were instrumental in forcing governments to recognize there has to be some basic protections of individual civil liberties, and it has to be codified in law. And if Congress is not going to do it, we're going to force the Supreme Court to interpret the Bill of Rights in light of contemporary situations. For instance, in the beginning of the 1920s, the Supreme Court remained rather conservative. For instance, the Espionage Act that outlawed spying and also outlawed interfering with the draft, outlawed interfering with the government's prosecution of the war, that was upheld as constitutional, in spite of the fact that it was a fundamental violation of First Amendment principles. The Supreme Court was still very conservative. But slowly but surely, you start having a shift amongst the members on the Supreme Court. People that used to be in the minority, that felt this was a little bit too much government responsibility, government repression, were slowly changing the minds of their colleagues to respect civil liberties. For instance, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who went on to become one of the most famous Supreme Court justices in American history, for good, not for doing boneheaded things. He claimed that America survived best if it had what's known as a marketplace of ideas. What does that mean? It means government should not be in the business of censorship or shutting down newspapers. Government should allow the free flow of all ideas, just like it allows the free flow of consumer products. You can buy anything you want in a store. So why wouldn't you allow individuals to experiment with all the ideas that are out there and then let them pick and choose what they like? The bad ideas will simply disappear because they're unpopular. Give Americans the freedom to choose, just like you give Americans the freedom to buy whatever they want. This was a very convincing argument at a time when Americans were demanding the freedom to do anything they wanted in the consumer society. Oliver Wendell Holmes said, give them the same freedom when they're shopping around for ideas. Louis Brandeis, who may have been the first Jewish Supreme Court justice, and that already was revolutionary, came up with what's known as the democratic citizenship doctrine. And it was a pretty straightforward idea which he convinced his colleagues to follow. If you want a real democracy, one that works, where the people are informed, where they keep government in check, they just don't get told what to do, they push back at unpopular ideas, you need to have freedom of speech. That is the only way to preserve democracy in America. Now remember, this is the idea that Eugene Debs used in his speech. Freedom of speech protects American democracy. A socialist who was thrown in prison. A few years later, a Supreme Court justice is arguing the exact same thing. Ideas have a tendency to catch on if they're popular. Because of this shift in thinking on the Supreme Court, other cases which came to the Supreme Court started getting a more sympathetic hearing. For instance, in the 1920s, at the end of the 1920s, when this shift in thinking towards more liberal thinking took place, the court overturned a law from Kansas that banned advocating unlawful acts to change the government or economic system. Remember, during World War I, if you said anything against the system of government or capitalism, that was punishable by law. Kansas had a similar law. The Supreme Court overruled it, saying you have the freedom of speech to say things against capitalism, against the American government. We're not going to throw you in jail for that. In Minnesota, they had a state law that allowed you to shut down the newspaper if you don't like their thinking. The Supreme Court said, you can't do that. You cannot shut down a newspaper just because they publish unlikable stories. You could sue them if they're lying, but you can't just shut them down because they print something you don't like. And remember, precedent. If Kansas can't outlaw controversial speech, then no other state can, because the Supreme Court said Kansas can't do it. And that's precedent. You understand what I'm saying? If the Supreme Court says Minnesota can't shut down a newspaper, then no other state can either. That's why the Supreme Court decisions are so consequential. The people bringing cases up there are not representing America, but the decisions of the Supreme Court affect everybody. Go.
But wasn't the Supreme Court contradicting themselves? Because first they upheld the first law, but then they're telling everybody else
right.
No, you can do that, no, you can do that.
But that was at the beginning of the 20s, and then at the end of the 20s. This is all end of the 20s. What else did they do? There was a woman by the name of Mary Bennett who mailed sex education pamphlets throughout the country in order to help educate men and women about, how sex works. Because remember when I talked about Emma Goldman and Margaret Sanger, who tried to educate women about simple birth control methods and procedures, and they were, criticized, arrested, bullied, etc.? Well, the Supreme Court said a decade later If you mail sex education pamphlets around the country, people may not like it, but you have a freedom of speech right to do so. So the onus is no longer on, we're going to protect you from, hurtful speech. No, we're going to trust you like adults. You read what you want or you don't read it. But you can't tell people you can't write it and you can't distribute it. Finally, and this is my personal favorite, there is a book by James Joyce, an Irish writer, called Ulysses. Ulysses. James Joyce, an Irish writer living in Italy. He wrote this book called Ulysses, very modern. The book is about 600 pages long. I don't know. It is long. Even in paperback, it's heavy, and it's huge. This thick, this size, this thick. Looks like the Bible, it's so big. Now, that 600-page, small font book was the life of one man in one day. It was every single thought that he had in his head. Every conversation, every background thought, that was the basis of this book. Very modern. Trying to focus on individual perception versus just telling a general story. You follow me so far? Have you ever heard of that idea that men think of sex once every 30 seconds? No? Okay, there's a stat out there that says men think of sex once every 30 seconds. Not actually having sex, but something involving sex. All right? Even if that's true once an hour, once every 6 hours, in this book, which dealt with every thought that went through the character's head in one day, there was a few times where he had images and fantasies of having sex with somebody, which James Joyce wrote about. So he wrote about, I'm walking down the street, I see the pigeon, I want to have sex with this person. The book. You follow me? Right? Well, at a conservative time, in the early 1920s, where films and books were being censored because of indecent behavior, like long kisses were not allowed in films. Can you imagine that? Long kisses used to be too much compared to what we now see on cable television, right? The book James Joyce was banned. It was banned. You couldn't buy it in America. At the end of the 1920s, the Supreme Court said, America can handle one artist's depiction of one character's 2 or 3 page sexual fantasy in the midst of a 600-page book. But the thing is, once you make it legal for artists to write even controversial, even unpopular things, and the Supreme Court said they have a freedom of speech right to do so, you don't have to buy it, but they have the right to write it and sell it. Well, that opens the doors to pretty much everything, which is good and bad, right? There's a lot of stuff out there on the internet in print, but no one's forcing you to buy it. But it's out there. So there are consequences to all this. That is where I'm ending today. I'm not sort of force-feeding you all of Chapter 20 in one sitting, because that would be cruel and unusual punishment. Does anybody know what amendment that is from? 8. Excellent. Who said it?